Valentine on Palmar Island. A Love on Palmar Island Romance. Written by Susanne. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Chapter 1. Charlotte Bennett drummed her fingers on the steering wheel as she approached the bridge to Palmar Island. The morning sun glinted off the water, creating a shimmer that made her wish she could stop right there and capture the moment. But there would be time for spontaneous shots later. Right now, she had a schedule to keep. The Sutton publishing deadline loomed in her mind as she crossed the causeway. 6 weeks to photograph every historic landmark on the island, each image needing to capture not just the architecture, but the soul of this place. Coffee table books were more than just pretty pictures. They were stories told through light and shadow, perspective and detail. At least, that's what she'd promised during her pitch meeting. Her rental car crested the bridge, and Palmar Island spread out before her like a watercolor painting. The morning light cast long shadows across weathered buildings and bare oak branches. To her right, waves lapped at a sandy shoreline dotted with wooden piers. To her left, Main Street beckoned with its row of historic shops, their windows decorated with remnants of holiday garland not yet taken down. "Well, this is promising," she murmured, slowing down to take in the details. A door swung open, releasing the smell of coffee and fresh pastries into the crisp morning air. 2 locals in heavy coats hurried into the general store, and even the hardware store, with its faded red awning, looked like it belonged on a postcard. Charlotte pulled into a parking spot near her first assignment. The Caraway Building. She'd researched it extensively. Built in 1892, one of the island's first brick structures, and currently undergoing restoration. But nothing in her research had prepared her for its quiet grandeur. Bare vines crept up the weathered brick facade, framing windows with elaborate wooden trim that someone had clearly spent hours carving by hand. The winter light cast deep shadows across the porch columns, emphasizing every detailed curve and groove. "Now this," she said, reaching for her camera bag, "this is exactly what I'm looking for." She grabbed her tripod from the trunk, along with the leather messenger bag that held her notes and permits. The whole process of setting up was familiar, a dance she'd performed countless times in countless places. Position the tripod. Check the light. Adjust the lens. Her fingers were stiff from the cold as she made the final adjustments. She was just about to take her first shot when a deep voice broke her concentration. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop right there. This is an active restoration site." Charlotte lowered her camera and turned toward the voice. A tall man in a flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows stood at the bottom of the building's steps. Sawdust dusted his shoulders and clung to his sandy brown hair. His stance was solid, protective even, as if he'd planted himself between her and the building. "I have permission to be here," she said, reaching for her bag. "Charlotte Bennett. I'm photographing the island's historic buildings for Sutton Publishing." She pulled out the folder containing her permits and documentation. "Grant Lawson." He climbed the steps, closing the distance between them. "I'm the restoration specialist working on the Caraway." His blue eyes studied her permits with the same intensity she'd been about to direct at his handiwork. "These structures are more delicate than most people realize." He tapped his boot against the porch planking. "One wrong step on these boards could damage work that's taken weeks to stabilize." Charlotte felt her jaw tighten. "Mr. Lawson, I've photographed historic sites all over the world. I know how to work around restoration projects without compromising them." She kept her tone professional, but couldn't quite hide her irritation. Did he think she was some tourist with a point-and-shoot? "All over the world," he repeated, handing back her permits. Something in his voice made her look up from returning them to her bag. His expression had shifted slightly. It was still cautious, but there was a hint of curiosity. "Then you understand why we're particular about who gets close to these old places." "I do." Charlotte adjusted her camera strap. "And I promise, your restoration work will look beautiful in the book." The Suttons specifically wanted to highlight the craftsmanship that goes into preserving these buildings. Grant's shoulders relaxed a fraction. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden bark interrupted whatever he was about to say. Charlotte turned to see a scruffy white and brown dog trotting up the sidewalk, tail wagging as if he'd been invited to join their conversation. For the first time since their encounter began, a small smile tugged at Grant's lips. "And this is our unofficial project supervisor. He shows up every morning to inspect the work." The dog circled Charlotte's legs once, before sitting at her feet, looking up at her with bright, hopeful eyes. Without thinking, she crouched down to scratch behind his ears. "Does the supervisor have a name?" "Not that I know of. Shows up at most of my work sites." Grant watched as the dog leaned into Charlotte's touch. "He seems to approve of you." Charlotte laughed. "Well, that's a relief. Maybe now I can get back to work?" She stood, brushing dog hair from her jeans. "Unless the supervisor has any other concerns?" Grant's expression softened. "I think we're good. Just be careful on the north side of the porch. Those boards aren't secure yet." The dog settled himself between them, tail sweeping against the weathered wood of the porch. Charlotte couldn't help noticing how his presence had shifted the energy between her and Grant. "Does he belong to anyone?" she asked, crouching down again to scratch under the dog's chin. His fur was matted in places, but his eyes were bright and intelligent. "No, he's been wandering the island for a few months now." Grant leaned against one of the porch columns. "Shows up at most of my work sites, charms a few treats out of the restaurant owners, then disappears until the next day." The dog had discovered Charlotte's camera bag and was nosing it curiously. She gently redirected him, earning a sloppy kiss on her hand for her efforts. "Quite the little entrepreneur, aren't you?" she said to the dog. "I could use an assistant for these shoots. Someone to carry my equipment, maybe warn me about protective carpenters?" That earned her another smile from Grant, this one reaching his eyes. "He'd probably work for treats and belly rubs. Don't we all?" Charlotte stood, brushing dog hair from her jeans again. The morning sun had risen higher, changing the light on the building's facade. "I should get started while the light's good. Any other safety warnings I should know about?" Grant seemed to consider this for a moment. "Actually, if you're planning to photograph all the historic buildings, you might want a guide. Some of them are in pretty delicate condition." He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket. "Give me a call before you head to any of the restoration sites. I can make sure you don't end up somewhere unstable." Charlotte accepted the card, noting the simple text, "Grant Lawson, Historic Restoration Specialist," followed by a phone number. "I appreciate that." Grant nodded and headed inside, leaving Charlotte to her work. The dog, however, stayed by her side as she photographed the building from various angles, occasionally offering his opinion with a soft woof. An hour later, Charlotte packed up her equipment, satisfied with the morning's shots. The dog followed her to her car, sitting patiently while she loaded her gear. "You're not making this easy, are you?" she said, looking down at his hopeful expression. The sensible thing would be to drive away. She was here for work, not to adopt a stray dog. But something about his scruffy charm and immediate devotion tugged at her. "Oh, well." Charlotte opened the passenger door. "Hop in. We'll stop by the vet first, make sure you're healthy. Then maybe pick up some supplies?" The dog jumped in as if he'd been waiting for the invitation all morning, turning in a circle before settling into the seat. As Charlotte drove down Main Street, she glanced at her new companion. He'd already fallen asleep, his head resting on his paws, looking completely at home. Through her rearview mirror, she could see the Caraway building getting smaller, but Grant's faint smile stayed with her. Not a bad first day on the island, all things considered. She had some good shots, an unexpected dog, and the business card of a surprisingly handsome carpenter burning a hole in her pocket. Whatever else Palmar Island had in store for her, at least it wasn't boring. "What should I call you?" she asked the sleeping dog. He opened one eye, his tail thumping against the seat. "Milo," she decided. "You look like a Milo." The dog's tail thumped faster, and Charlotte laughed. "Milo it is, then. Welcome to the team." Chapter 2. Grant ran his fingers over the carved wooden trim, feeling for any rough spots he might have missed. The late January wind whistled through the gaps in the Caraway Building's windows, but he barely noticed the cold. This piece needed to be perfect. The decorative molding was original to the building, and he'd spent the better part of a week carefully stripping away decades of paint to reveal the craftsman's handiwork underneath. The sound of boots clicking on the hardwood floor behind him broke his concentration. "Grant Lawson, please tell me you weren't planning to work straight through lunch again." He turned to find Miss Doris approaching, a covered basket over one arm and determination in her steel-gray eyes. Her silver curls bounced with each step, and her wool coat was buttoned up against the chill. "Miss Doris, you didn't have to." "Of course I didn't have to." She set the basket down on his work table. "But someone needs to make sure you eat more than those protein bars you keep in your truck." The rich smell of beef stew made his stomach growl. Grant set down his sandpaper and wiped his hands on a rag. "You're too good to me." "I know." She unpacked the basket with practiced efficiency. She handed him a thermos of stew, fresh cornbread wrapped in a checkered cloth, and what looked suspiciously like her famous apple hand pies. "Now, tell me about this photographer who's been wandering around the island." Grant paused with a spoonful of stew halfway to his mouth. "Charlotte Bennett?" Miss Doris settled onto the wooden chair he kept for breaks, smoothing her skirt. "Evelyn Sutton told me all about the coffee table book. Says it'll be wonderful publicity for the island." "Does she now?" He should have known that the wealthy head of the Sutton Corporation would be in touch with Miss Doris. They were practically neighbors on the rare occasions Evelyn was on the island. Her children, on the other hand, practically lived here. "Ms. Bennett seems to know what she's doing." Grant broke off a piece of cornbread. "Has a good eye for detail." "And what else?" "What do you mean, what else?" Miss Doris's eyes twinkled. "Well, she's a pretty little thing, isn't she? Creative too, from what I hear. The kind of person who might appreciate all this history you're always going on about." "Miss Doris, don't be getting any ideas." Grant tried to sound stern, but it was hard to be stern with someone who'd been feeding him since he was knee-high. "I'm helping her navigate the restoration sites. That's all. It's my job to make sure these buildings are protected." "Of course it is, dear." She patted his arm. "Just like it's my job to make sure you don't work yourself into an early grave. Speaking of which, I heard she adopted that stray dog that's always following you around. Took it to the vet and everything." Grant smiled despite himself. "He took to her right away." "Smart dog." Miss Doris rose, gathering her basket. "You know, the Pelican Inn's next on her list. The way I hear it, she'll be there this afternoon to photograph the parlor." "Is that so?" Grant kept his tone neutral, but Miss Doris's raised eyebrow told him he wasn't fooling anyone. "The front steps could use some attention," she said innocently. "In case you were looking for somewhere to be useful today." After she left, Grant found himself staring at the piece of trim in his hands. Charlotte had noticed things about the Caraway Building that most people missed: the way the morning light hit the carved details, the subtle patterns in the brickwork. She saw the island the way he did, but through a different lens. He glanced at his watch. The Pelican Inn steps really could use some work, and he did promise to help Charlotte navigate the restoration sites safely. It was just part of the job, he told himself, packing up his tools. Nothing more than that. The Pelican Inn's front steps creaked under Grant's boots as he climbed to the wraparound porch. He'd rebuilt these steps himself 5 years ago, and already they needed attention again. The salt air was relentless. "About time you showed up." Jacob Oswald, the general contractor, met him at the door. "Got a situation with the parlor's crown molding you need to look at." Grant followed Jacob inside, inhaling the familiar smell of sawdust and old wood. The inn's renovation was moving along. Drop cloths covered antique furniture, and tools were scattered across makeshift workbenches. "See here?" Jacob pointed to a section of molding that had partially separated from the ceiling. Previous owner tried to repair it with construction adhesive. Grant shook his head, running his hand along the decorative trim. Amateur fix. We'll need to. The sound of car doors closing outside interrupted him. Through the window, he watched Charlotte unload her camera equipment, the dog dancing around her feet. She'd tied her dark hair back today, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. I'll grab my tools, Grant said, maybe a bit too quickly. Jacob's knowing look suggested he wasn't being subtle. By the time Charlotte entered, Grant was already working on the molding. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Should I come back later? No, you're fine. Grant climbed down from his ladder. I can show you around if you'd like. There are some interesting architectural details you might want to capture. Charlotte's face lit up. That would be great. She adjusted her camera strap, while the stray trotted past them to investigate a corner. The fireplace is original, Grant said, leading her toward the massive stone structure. Those carved medallions? They tell the story of the family who built this place. See how this one shows a ship? Charlotte leaned in close, her camera forgotten for the moment. The detail is incredible. Who did the carving? Local craftsman named Thomas Wheeler. Story goes, he fell in love with the owner's daughter while working on it. Grant traced the intricate pattern with his finger. You can see his initials hidden in the corner here. Did he get the girl? Actually, yeah. Their grandson still lives in the area. Charlotte smiled, already raising her camera. I love that. These aren't just buildings, are they? They're stories. Exactly. Grant watched as she framed her shot, appreciating how carefully she considered each angle. A crash from behind them made them both jump. Milo, she called, get over here. The dog had knocked over a container of nails, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Sorry, Charlotte hurried to help clean up, but Grant was already laughing. Milo's got your enthusiasm for exploring every corner, he said, earning a mock glare from Charlotte. They worked their way through the inn, Grant pointing out details while Charlotte photographed them. In the grand dining room, afternoon sun slanted through the wavy glass windows, casting patterns across the hardwood floor. This light is perfect, Charlotte murmured, adjusting her settings. Her face glowed in the warm light as she worked, completely absorbed in capturing the moment. What made you choose photography? Grant found himself asking. Charlotte lowered her camera, considering. I love how a single image can tell an entire story. Like this room. She gestured around them. You can almost see the dinner parties, the celebrations, all those moments frozen in time. She paused. What about you? Why restoration? These buildings, they're part of who we are here. Every time we save one, we're keeping those stories alive. Grant ran his hand along the dining room's chair rail. Most people just see old buildings. But they're more than that. I'm starting to understand that, Charlotte said softly. Thank you, by the way. For sharing all this with me. It adds so much depth to what I'm trying to capture. Grant felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Just doing my job, he managed, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Later, as he watched Charlotte's car disappear down the Oakline Drive, Milo's head hanging happily out the window, Grant realized he was already thinking about tomorrow. About which building she might photograph next, what stories he could share with her. About how her face lit up when she talked about her work, and how he wanted to see that light again. Not good, he muttered to himself, turning back to his tools. Chapter 3. Charlotte pushed open the door of Palmar Island Hardware and Feed, a brass bell jingling overhead. The warmth inside was a welcome relief from the January chill. The store smelled of fresh-cut lumber, rope, and that indefinable scent that all hardware stores seem to share. Milo trotted in behind her, his nails clicking against the worn wooden floors. Old-fashioned displays lined the aisles. There were galvanized buckets filled with nails, coils of rope hanging from hooks, and the shelves were stocked with everything from work gloves to water filters. The building itself was a testament to the island's history, with its exposed brick walls and pressed tin ceiling. Charlotte made a mental note to ask about photographing the interior for her book. Well, if it isn't our newest resident and her shadow. Kenny Brown looked up from where he was restocking shelves, his weathered face creasing into a smile. He set down a box of brass fittings and dusted off his hands. What can I help you find today? Some basic supplies. Charlotte pulled out her list, written on the back of one of Grant's business cards. Not that she'd admit to anyone why she'd kept it. And treats for this one. He's earned them. Has he now? Kenny chuckled, coming around the counter. That pup used to spend every morning following Grant Lawson around. Now look at him. He traded in sawdust for camera equipment. Smart upgrade, if you ask me. Does everyone on this island know everyone else's business? Charlotte asked with a smile. That's half the fun of living here. Kenny winked. Speaking of Grant, he's working on our exterior brick today. Building's original to 1875, you know. Might be worth a chapter in that fancy book of yours. I'd love to photograph it, Charlotte said, watching Milo nose his way along a shelf of garden tools. This is exactly the kind of place I'm looking for. Somewhere with character. She reached down to scratch Milo's ears. Milo here has been great company while I explore. Makes the island feel a little less unfamiliar. She ran her fingers along a display of old brass hardware. Everything here feels like it has a story. That's because it does. Kenny pointed her toward the pet supplies. Treats are down that aisle. Let me know if you need anything else. Charlotte was comparing different types of dog biscuits, trying to decide between chicken and beef flavors, when she realized Milo was no longer at her feet. She turned to find the store's front door slightly ajar, the bell still swaying. Oh no. She rushed outside, spotting Milo's tail disappearing around the corner. The cold air bit at her cheeks. Milo! Get back here! The dog ignored her, trotting purposefully down the sidewalk. Charlotte hurried after him, her boots echoing against the brick buildings. Ahead, she could see scaffolding set up against the hardware store's exterior wall, and below it, a familiar figure examining the brickwork. Grant was focused intently on his work, carefully removing old mortar with specialized tools she didn't know the names of. Milo made a beeline for Grant, circling his legs with an enthusiastic bark. I'm so sorry, Charlotte called out, slightly out of breath. Her cheeks felt warm, despite the cold. He just took off. Grant was already crouching down to scratch Milo's ears, a broad grin on his face. Let me guess, he escaped the hardware store? His tool belt clinked as he moved, and Charlotte noticed how his hands, rough from work, were surprisingly gentle with the dog. He did. Charlotte stared at the two of them. How'd you know? He used to do it to me all the time. The door doesn't always close properly, and Milo's figured out how to nose it open when that happens. Grant's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He's smarter than he looks. Charlotte couldn't help but laugh. So this is a regular thing for him? Should I be jealous he's still coming to find you? Oh yeah. He's got some kind of radar. Grant stood, brushing brick dust from his jeans. The winter sun caught the auburn highlights in his hair. When I first started seeing him around, he'd show up at whatever building I was working on. Didn't matter if it was clear across the island. How long has he been here? Showed up last summer. Started following me around, then decided the whole island needed supervising. Grant leaned against the scaffolding. Pretty soon he had half the town feeding him. Mary at the diner saves him bacon scraps. Miss Doris started keeping treats in her garden for him. Even old Mr. Peterson, who claims to hate dogs, sneaks him sausage links every now and then. Charlotte watched as Milo settled contentedly at Grant's feet, looking entirely too pleased with himself. And apparently he's appointed himself my photography assistant. Lucky you. Grant gestured at the brick wall behind him. Speaking of photography, I'm uncovering some interesting details here. The original mason left his mark in some of these bricks. And there's this small island with a historic lighthouse. A small path heads to what's left of the original lighthouse keeper's cottage. Not many people know about it, but the view's incredible. Might be worth a shot for your book. Really? Charlotte felt a flutter of excitement, both at the prospect of discovering a hidden gem and at the offer itself. She'd been hoping for exactly this kind of local insight. Raising her camera, she took a few shots, moving around to get the detail he was pointing out. I could show you, if you want. I'm heading that way tomorrow afternoon to check on some structural issues with the cottage foundation. It's not stable enough for regular visitors, but I know which areas are safe. I'd like that. Charlotte tried to keep her voice casual, though her heart had picked up speed. What time? They made plans to meet at 2, and Charlotte turned to head back to the hardware store. Come on, Milo. You've caused enough trouble for one day. The dog looked between her and Grant, tail wagging, before finally trotting after her. She could have sworn he looked smug. You found him, Kenny said with a wink when she returned to buy the treats. He was writing up her receipt with deliberate slowness. That dog always seems to know exactly where he's needed. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. He just likes attention. If you say so. Kenny's knowing smile suggested he thought otherwise. You know, Grant usually works through lunch when he's focused on a project. Man could use someone to remind him to take breaks now and then. Kenny. Charlotte warned, but she was smiling as she gathered her purchases. Back in her car, Charlotte looked at Milo, who was already curled up in the passenger seat. You're not as subtle as you think you are, she told him, reaching over to ruffle his fur. Milo just wagged his tail and closed his eyes, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Charlotte sat for a moment, her hand resting on the steering wheel, thinking about the way Grant's eyes had lit up when he talked about the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Charlotte pulled her coat tighter as she approached the harbor. The morning sun sparkled on the water, but did little to ward off the January chill. Grant was already there, helping Milo hop into a small boat tied to the dock. Morning, he called out. Hope you don't mind a short boat ride. Should have mentioned the lighthouse isn't exactly walking distance. Charlotte paused at the edge of the dock. We're going out to that island? She pointed to where the lighthouse stood in silhouette against the bright sky. That's the one. Grant held out his hand to help her into the boat. His palm was warm against hers, steady and strong. Don't worry, the water's calm today. The boat ride took less than half an hour, but Charlotte found herself stealing glances at Grant as he navigated. He looked completely at home on the water, one hand on the wheel, the other absently scratching Milo's ears. The wind had brought color to his cheeks and ruffled his hair. When they reached the small island, Grant secured the boat while Charlotte got her first close look at the lighthouse. It rose stark and beautiful against the winter sky, its white paint weathered by decades of salt air and storms. The last keeper lived here well into the 1980s, Grant said as they walked up the trail. Even after they automated the light. Wouldn't leave his wife behind. His wife? Grant nodded toward a cluster of trees. She's buried here, along with others who lived on the island. Whole families made their lives here, only going to the mainland for supplies. They wandered through the small graveyard, reading the worn inscriptions. Charlotte found herself moving closer to Grant as they studied the stones, drawn to the quiet reverence in his voice as he shared the stories. Look at these dates, she murmured, crouching to photograph a cluster of small markers. 3 children, all in 1877. Probably influenza, Grant said softly. Living out here, medical help would have been hard to reach in bad weather. Milo chose that moment to wedge himself between them, nearly knocking Charlotte off balance. Grant caught her elbow, steadying her. His hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. Thanks, she said, hoping the cold air explained her flushed cheeks. Your assistant isn't very subtle, is he? Never has been. Grant's smile made her pulse skip. Want to see the keeper's cottage next? What's left of it, anyway? Hurricane Hugo took most of it. They picked their way through the undergrowth to the cottage's foundation. Charlotte noticed how Grant automatically offered his hand at rough patches, and how natural it felt to take it. The cottage would have been small, Grant explained, but sturdy. Had to be out here. He traced a finger along the weathered stone. See these grooves? That's where the original door frame Saturday. Charlotte raised her camera, capturing the way the winter light played across the ruins. When she lowered it, she found Grant watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You see it too, don't you? He asked quietly. The beauty in these old places? I do. She found herself stepping closer. It's not just about the structures. It's about the lives lived here, the stories. Milo chose that moment to charge into the surf, sending up a spectacular spray of icy water. His happy barking broke the moment, and they both laughed. Milo! Charlotte called. Get out of there, you crazy dog. But Milo had other ideas, shaking himself vigorously and soaking them both. Without hesitation, Grant pulled off his jacket, trying to corral the wet dog. Here, Charlotte said, moving to help. She grabbed one end of the jacket while Grant held the other, both of them attempting to wrap it around the squirming dog. Their hands brushed, and Charlotte felt the contact like an electric current through her cold fingers. The winter air had painted Grant's cheeks red, but his hands were warm when they touched hers. She found herself noticing things she shouldn't. The way his Henley pulled across his shoulders as he leaned forward, how the muscles in his forearms flexed as he tried to hold Milo still. His laugh lines deepened when he smiled, and this close, she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. Hold still, you mutt, Grant chuckled, his voice carrying that low, rough quality that made Charlotte's stomach flip. She was acutely aware of how little space separated them as they worked together. Every time Milo moved, they shifted closer. Grant's breath warmed her cheek. If she turned her head just slightly. Their eyes met over Milo's damp fur. Grant's smile faded into something more intense, and Charlotte forgot about the cold, about the wet dog, about everything except the way he was looking at her. His gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment before meeting her eyes again. A heartbeat later, she wondered if she imagined it. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Grant leaned forward slightly, and she found herself swaying toward him. Milo chose that exact moment to shake again, spraying them both with cold water and effectively shattering the moment. He'll be fine, Grant said, his voice still carrying that lower register that made her shiver. And not from the cold. Dog knows exactly what he's doing. Charlotte wasn't sure if he meant the swim or the way Milo kept pushing them together, but her pulse was racing and her skin tingled where their hands had touched. She watched as Grant ran a hand through his hair, leaving it charmingly disheveled, and tried to remember that she was here to photograph historic buildings, not daydream about almost kisses with handsome carpenters. The sun was high overhead by the time they headed back to the boat. As Grant steered them toward the mainland, he cleared his throat. There's an old rice plantation about a mile inland. The gardens are still there, winter roses blooming. Might make for good photos, if you're interested. Charlotte smiled, watching the lighthouse grow smaller behind them. I'd like that. Milo, curled up at their feet, thumped his tail against the boat's hull, and Charlotte could have sworn he looked pleased with himself. Chapter 4. Grant pulled his truck into the marina parking lot, the salt-laden air hitting him as soon as he opened his door. A few fishing boats were already heading out, their running lights bright against the pre-dawn sky. He'd scheduled an early pickup of some salvaged dockwood. Heart pine that would be perfect for restoring the Cartwright building's original flooring. But his thoughts kept drifting to Charlotte and that moment at the lighthouse 2 days ago. He grabbed his coffee thermos and made his way toward the harbor master's office. The wooden planks of the dock creaked under his boots, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. A gust of wind carried the scent of coffee and bacon from Mary's diner up the street, mixing with the briny smell of low tide. Morning, Grant. Joe Camden, one of the local shrimpers, gave him a nod as he coiled rope on his deck. Cold enough for you? Getting there. Grant pulled his jacket tighter. The temperature had dropped into the 30s overnight, and the wind off the water cut straight through denim and flannel. He was signing for his delivery when movement on the far dock caught his eye. Charlotte stood near the edge, camera raised, capturing the way the rising sun painted the water in shades of pink and gold. Milo sat at her feet, his tail sweeping away a patch of frost on the wooden planks. Grant's hand stalled mid-signature as he watched her work. She'd tied her dark hair back, but the wind had pulled strands free that danced around her face. She kept tucking them behind her ear as she adjusted her camera settings, a gesture he found unreasonably distracting. "You gonna finish that paperwork, or should I come back later?" The harbor master's amused voice snapped Grant back to the task at hand. "Sorry, Jim." He quickly scrawled his signature, aware of the knowing look the older man gave him. By the time he'd arranged for the lumber delivery, Charlotte had moved closer to his end of the dock. She lowered her camera when she spotted him, and the smile that lit up her face sent warmth spreading through his chest. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said as he approached. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and Grant fought the urge to brush back another strand of hair that the wind had set free. Picking up some materials. He gestured toward where his order waited. "Heart pine. Original to the island. Some of these old docks were built with it." Charlotte's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? I'd love to get some shots of the restoration process, if you wouldn't mind. Show how the old becomes new again." "I'd like that." The words came out softer than he intended, and something shifted in her expression. The air between them felt charged, like it had on the lighthouse island when they'd been so close. Milo chose that moment to nose against Grant's hand, breaking the tension. "You've got good timing, buddy," Grant muttered, scratching the dog's ears. To Charlotte, he said, "Want to see something interesting? This dock's been here since the 1850s. Used to be where supply boats would unload everything from sugar to fabric." He led her toward the oldest section of the marina, pointing out the wear patterns in the wood where cartwheels had once run. "It's amazing how much history is here." Charlotte ran her hand along a weathered piling. "I've photographed historic places all over, but there's something different about Palmar Island. Everything feels connected. That's what I love about it." Grant leaned against the railing, watching a pelican dive into the harbor. "Every building, every board, every story, they're all part of each other. Part of us." "Must be nice," Charlotte said quietly. "Having such deep roots." Grant studied her profile as she gazed out at the water. "You've never wanted to put down roots anywhere? Never stayed in one place long enough to try?" She turned to face him, and Grant was struck by the vulnerability in her expression. "My whole life has been about capturing moments and moving on. But lately?" "Lately?" Their eyes met, and Grant felt that same pull he'd experienced at the lighthouse. Charlotte took a small step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "Mr. Lawson." A voice called from the harbor master's office. "Your delivery's ready." Charlotte stepped back, and Grant had to resist the urge to pull her closer again. "I should." He gestured vaguely toward his waiting lumber. "Of course." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I need get back to work anyway. The light's perfect right now." About the rice plantation, Grant said quickly. "Would Friday work for you? The winter roses are starting to bloom." The smile that spread across her face was genuine this time. Friday would be perfect. As Grant drove away later, his truck bed loaded with heart pine, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Charlotte had looked at him, or how natural it felt to share the island's stories with her. For someone who'd spent her life capturing moments and moving on, she was starting to feel remarkably permanent. Grant pushed open the door to the roasted bean, warmth and the rich scent of coffee enveloping him after the bite of the January afternoon. He'd meant to grab a coffee and head back to work, but the sight of Charlotte at a corner table made him pause. She sat curled in one of the coffee shop's oversized leather chairs, her laptop balanced on her knees, while Milo dozed at her feet. The cafe was quiet this time of day, that lull between lunch and closing when locals drifted in seeking refuge from the cold. Old heart pine floors gleamed under Edison bulbs, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on exposed brick walls. Charlotte looked up as he approached, her face brightening. "Hey stranger." She closed her laptop. "Done with the lumber delivery?" "All unloaded." He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" "Please." She shifted, making room on the small table between them for his coffee. "I was just going through today's shots from the marina." Grant ordered at the counter, black coffee and, on impulse, 2 slices of Mitch's famous orange cranberry bread, before settling into the chair opposite Charlotte. Close enough that their knees almost touched. "Want to see what I captured this morning?" she asked, already reopening her laptop. He moved his chair closer, telling himself it was just to see the screen better. Charlotte's shoulder brushed his as she scrolled through the images, and he caught the faint scent of her shampoo. It had a warm, faintly floral scent that was even more intoxicating than the freshly roasted coffee beans. "These are incredible," he said, meaning it. She'd caught the marina in a way he'd never seen before, though he'd spent countless mornings there. The play of light on water, the weathered texture of old wood, the quiet dignity of working boats. She saw it all. "Really?" She turned to gauge his reaction, and suddenly they were face to face, barely inches apart. Neither moved away. "Really," he said softly. "You see things others miss." She looked back at the screen. "Sometimes I wonder if that's all I do. See things, capture them, move on." "What do you mean?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment, absently running her finger around the rim of her coffee mug. "I love what I do. But lately, I don't know. Maybe I'm tired of always being the observer, never really being part of the story." Grant thought about that, about how to put into words what he'd been feeling. "You know what I thought when I first met you?" She shook her head, looking up at him. "I thought you were just passing through. Here to take pretty pictures and leave. But that's not what you do at all. You don't just observe. You understand. Like this morning, when you asked about the heart pine. You wanted to know the story behind it. Is that why you keep showing me all your secret spots?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Because I ask the right questions?" "Maybe." He returned her smile, aware of how close they still were. "Or maybe I like having someone to share them with." Something soft and warm pressed against his leg. Milo had woken up and wedged himself between their chairs, his chin resting on Grant's knee. "Traitor," Charlotte laughed, but there was warmth in her voice. "He's got good taste." Grant scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know, sometimes I wonder if I've gone too far the other way." "What do you mean?" "Staying here, preserving everything exactly as it was. Sometimes I worry I'm so focused on protecting the past that I'm not building anything new." The words surprised him. He hadn't meant to be quite so honest. Charlotte's hand found his forearm, her touch light but steady. "You are building something. Every building you restore, every story you save matters." Her fingers were warm through his sleeve. "And you share it all so freely. Like that rice plantation you mentioned the other day. The one with the small chapel. Indigo Bluff?" Grant felt a smile tug at his lips. "The chapel was one of my first solo projects. Probably why it means so much to me." "Tell me about it?" So he did. He told her about the tiny chapel with its hand-carved pews and stained glass windows, how he'd spent months restoring the intricate woodwork. How sometimes, when a project felt overwhelming, he'd go there just to sit and think. "I'd love to see it," Charlotte said softly when he finished. "I could take you." The words came out before he could second-guess them. "Tomorrow, maybe? The light's best in the afternoon." "I'd like that." She smiled, and Grant noticed a dimple he hadn't seen before. The coffee shop had grown darker while they talked, the winter sun setting early. Charlotte gathered her things while Grant helped Milo into his jacket, a purchase that had amused him when he first saw it, but made sense given the cold snap. At the door, Charlotte turned to him. "Thank you for sharing all that." Thank you for listening. He held the door, and she passed close enough that he caught that floral scent again. Walking to his truck later, Grant realized something that should have worried him. He was falling for her. Not just her beauty or her talent, but her curiosity, her gentle questions, the way she saw his island through new eyes while understanding what made it special. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Chapter 5. Charlotte pulled up to Indigo Bluff Plantation, where Grant's truck was already parked beneath a canopy of bare oak branches. The January sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the grounds. Milo's tail thumped against the passenger seat as he spotted Grant leaning against his truck. From this elevation, she could see why they'd chosen this spot for the main house. The bluff overlooked acres of dormant rice fields that stretched to the water's edge, the geometric patterns of the old irrigation systems still visible in the winter light. She grabbed her camera bag, and Milo bounded out ahead of her, making a beeline for Grant. The plantation house rose behind him. It was a grand antebellum structure with white columns and wraparound porches that took full advantage of the elevated view. Perfect timing, Grant said as she approached. Lights just right. He'd dressed up a bit, she noticed. Dark jeans instead of his usual work pants, and a blue sweater that made his eyes look even deeper. Not that she was paying attention to such things. This is incredible, she breathed, taking in the scope of the property. Even in winter, it held a haunting beauty. The bare trees were draped with Spanish moss, their branches creating intricate patterns against the pale sky. The original owners grew both rice and indigo here, Grant explained as they started up the main drive. That's how it got its name. They used the bluff for indigo processing, and the lower grounds for rice cultivation. The elevation helped protect the house during storm surges. Smart planning. Wait till you see the gardens. Grant gestured for her to follow. The winter roses are blooming early this year. They're not original to Indigo Bluff, but they were planted in the 1920s when the Murray family restored the property. They walked along a brick path, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Grant's voice took on that tone she'd come to recognize. The one that meant he was sharing something he truly cared about. This was one of the largest rice plantations in the area, he explained. The family who built it, well, it's a complicated history. Beauty and struggle all wrapped up together. We've tried to preserve it in a way that honors all the stories, not just the pretty ones. Charlotte nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She raised her camera, capturing the way shadow and light played across the weathered columns of the main house. Here, Grant said softly, stepping close behind her. His hand brushed her elbow, gently adjusting her position. If you shoot from this angle, you'll catch the reflection in the pond. Charlotte's breath caught at his proximity, but she managed to focus enough to take the shot. The image in her viewfinder was stunning. Indigo Bluff's facade reflected perfectly in the still water, framed by winter bare branches. Perfect, he murmured, still standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. A sudden commotion made them both turn. Milo had caught sight of a deer at the edge of the garden and had managed to tangle himself thoroughly in the strap of Charlotte's camera bag, which she'd temporarily set down to get the reflection shot. The bag tipped precariously as he pulled against the strap. Milo, no. Charlotte lunged for her equipment, but Grant was faster. He caught the bag with one hand and Milo's collar with the other, somehow keeping both the expensive camera gear and the excitable dog from disaster. The movement brought them chest to chest, Charlotte's hands landing on Grant's forearms as she helped stabilize her gear. Nice catch, she breathed, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. Grant's hands were warm and steady under hers. Just doing my part to protect the valuable equipment. His voice had dropped lower, and his eyes seemed to linger on her face before he looked down at Milo. Both the camera and our four-legged troublemaker. At least he's consistent with his timing, Charlotte said, reluctantly stepping back to untangle her camera strap from around Milo's legs. You noticed that too? Grant's eyes met hers, and something in his expression made her heart skip. They ended up sitting on an old wooden bench while Milo caught his breath. The dog sprawled at their feet in a patch of winter sunlight. Charlotte traced her fingers over initials carved into the bench's arm. JL plus MH, she read. 1943. My grandparents, Grant said quietly. They used to walk the grounds of Indigo Bluff every Sunday after church. Grandmother always said it was the most peaceful place on the island. Charlotte turned to look at him, struck by how deep his connections to this place ran. That must be nice, she said. Having so much history in one place. Sometimes I wonder if I'm too rooted here. He was staring out at the water, his profile strong against the afternoon light. Never really left, never saw the world the way you have. The world's overrated, Charlotte found herself saying. All these years of traveling, and I'm still looking for something that feels like. She trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought. Like home? Grant suggested softly. She nodded, suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, how easy it would be to lean into him. You know, Grant said, his voice low, sometimes home isn't about where you've always been. Sometimes it's about where you finally stop running. Charlotte turned to look at him, her heart pounding. His eyes held hers, and she watched as his gaze dropped to her lips. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. A cold, wet nose pressed between them as Milo decided he was ready for attention again. Charlotte laughed shakily, running her fingers through the dog's damp fur. Your timing is something else, she told him, but she couldn't quite meet Grant's eyes. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across Indigo Bluff's grounds, Grant pulled a silver thermos from his truck. Coffee break? He produced 2 ceramic mugs from a small canvas bag. Thought you might need warming up. You thought ahead. Charlotte followed him to a massive live oak, its bare branches creating a natural canopy above them. Someone had placed the old wooden bench beneath it years ago, the weathered seat smooth from countless visitors. Milo flopped down at their feet, apparently worn out from his earlier excitement with Charlotte's camera gear. The evening air had grown colder, and Charlotte found herself sitting closer to Grant than she'd planned as he poured the coffee. Thanks. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Perfect timing, actually. My fingers were starting to freeze. Hazard of the job? He settled back against the bench, his arm brushing hers. Photography in winter? Definitely. She took a sip, pleasantly surprised by the rich taste. This is good. Mitch's special blend. He guards that recipe like a state secret. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A cool breeze rustled through the oak branches, and Charlotte instinctively leaned closer to Grant's warmth. Town's getting decorated for Valentine's Day, Grant said casually. Miss Doris is already planning a get-together. Charlotte groaned. Don't remind me. Most commercial holiday of the year. Not a fan? I don't know. All the forced romance and pink hearts everywhere. She stared into her coffee. Though I did love those little candy hearts when I was a kid. You know, the ones with messages on them? Grant turned toward her, interest sparking in his eyes. Sweethearts? Charlotte smiled at the memory. I used to sort them by color and save my favorites. My dad would bring me a box every year. She laughed softly. I was probably the only kid who got excited about chalk-flavored candy. What was your favorite message? Be Mine was classic. But I liked the weird ones better. You rock or Far Out. They were like tiny conversations in a box. She glanced at him. Did you ever have them? Sometimes. His voice had gone soft, thoughtful. If I could design one for you, I know what it would say. Charlotte's heart skipped. Oh? Found my home. He said it simply, his eyes meeting hers in the fading light. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Because of the book project, she managed. Maybe. But his tone suggested otherwise. You see this place the way I do. Not just the buildings or the history, but the heart of it. Charlotte became acutely aware of every point of contact between them. The way their shoulders and arms touched, the way his knee had come to rest against hers. The evening had grown darker, the first stars appearing above the oak's branches. Grant, Milo chose that moment to sit up and rest his head on Grant's knee, looking between them with what Charlotte could have sworn was exasperation. Grant laughed, breaking the tension. I think someone's ready to head home. They gathered their things in the growing darkness, Grant's flashlight beam creating pools of light on the path back to their cars. Charlotte felt oddly unsettled, like something important had shifted, but she couldn't quite name it. At her car, Milo already settled in the passenger seat, Grant handed her the thermos. Keep it. In case your fingers get cold tomorrow. But it's yours. I've got others. He stepped back, hands in his pockets. Drive safe, Charlotte. She watched his truck's taillights disappear down the plantation's drive, the words "found my home" echoing in her mind. Next to her, Milo let out a small whine. I know, she told him. I know. On the drive home, Charlotte realized she'd taken dozens of photos, but couldn't remember half of what she'd shot. All she could think about was the warmth of Grant's shoulder against hers, the way his voice had softened when he talked about home, and how many times she'd caught him looking at her when he thought she was focused on her camera. Milo dozed in the passenger seat, still slightly damp and smelling of pond water. You're not very subtle, she told him. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Indigo Bluff growing smaller, its windows catching the last light of day. Chapter 6. Grant stood at his workbench, studying the pair of mahogany doors he'd brought in from the Thompson house. They'd survived a century of coastal winters, and with some careful restoration, they'd survive 100 more. He ran his hand along the decorative panels, feeling for rough spots in the wood. Usually, this kind of detail work absorbed him completely. But today, his thoughts kept drifting to Charlotte. To the way she'd looked in the fading light at Indigo Bluff, how her eyes had widened when he'd mentioned the sweetheart candy message. Focus, Lawson, he muttered, reaching for his sandpaper. The doors weren't going to restore themselves. Mid-morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching dust motes in its beam. The familiar scents of wood shavings and varnish filled the air, along with coffee from the mug on his bench. It was his third of the day. He'd been here since 7, though he'd accomplished less than he'd like to admit. His eyes kept straying to the brass sheet metal in the corner of his workshop. He'd bought it months ago for another project, but now. Setting down his sandpaper, Grant walked over and picked up the metal, testing its weight. Perfect for what he had in mind. Before he could talk himself out of it, he grabbed his sketchbook and a pencil. The design came quickly. A simple wooden box with brass hinges, sized to hold tokens, cut from the sheet metal. Each token would be a heart, small enough to fit in a palm, engraved with messages that said everything he wasn't sure how to say out loud. Found my home would be the first one, of course. Grant sketched it quickly, adding details for the engraving. Then stay a while, because he liked the way it could mean both the island and him. Be brave. That one made him smile, remembering how she'd followed Milo into all sorts of adventures. He was halfway through sketching True North when he realized what he was doing. Planning a Valentine's gift for a woman who'd made her career out of never staying in one place. Grant set down his pencil and walked to the workshop door, pushing it open to let in some fresh air. The breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean, and he could hear the distant sound of boats in the harbor. Everything that had always meant home to him. But now home meant something else too. It meant the way Charlotte's face lit up when she captured the perfect shot. The sound of her laugh when Milo got into trouble. The quiet moments when she really listened to the island's stories, understanding their worth. You're in deep, aren't you? He said to himself, but he was already walking back to his workbench. He pulled out his tools and began measuring the brass, marking where he'd cut the first token. The morning passed in a blur of careful cuts and precise measurements. By lunch, he had the first token cut and polished, ready for engraving. Grant held it up to the light, the brass catching the sun like a promise. A scratch at the door made him look up, half expecting to see Milo. But the workshop remained empty except for him and his projects. There were the doors he should be working on, and the gift he couldn't stop himself from making. Grant set the heart-shaped token down beside his coffee mug and picked up his sandpaper again. The doors needed his attention, and he had restoration work to complete. But he knew he'd be back at his bench later, cutting more tokens, carefully engraving each message. Maybe these small pieces of metal could tell Charlotte what he wasn't ready to say. That she'd found more than just a story on Palmar Island. That she'd found him. Grant walked along the beach, hands tucked into his jacket pockets against the February wind. He'd left the brass tokens cooling on his workbench, needing to clear his head before he started the engraving. The afternoon sun hung low over the water, and the beach was nearly empty. Only a few locals were walking their dogs, and then he spotted her. Charlotte. She stood near the water's edge, camera raised to capture something in the distance. Milo darted back and forth, chasing seagulls and leaving paw prints in the wet sand. Before Grant could decide whether to turn back, Milo spotted him and came bounding over, tail wagging. Charlotte lowered her camera and turned, a smile spreading across her face. "Hey, stranger." "Hey." He fell into step beside her as she started walking again. "Getting some shots of the sunset?" "Among other things." She gestured to where Milo was now digging enthusiastically in the sand. "He's been my main subject today. Though he's not very good at staying still." Grant laughed. "Never has been. Even as a stray, he was always moving, always exploring." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The wind had brought color to Charlotte's cheeks, and loose strands of hair escaped her ponytail to dance around her face. Grant fought the urge to brush them back. "I love it here this time of day," Charlotte said softly. "Everything feels quieter somehow. More real. The tourists haven't discovered our winter beaches yet." Grant watched a pelican dive into the waves. "Locals joke that February is when we get the island back to ourselves. I can see why you never left." Charlotte stopped to adjust her camera strap, then fell back in step with him. "Every day I find something new to love about this place." Grant's heart skipped at her words. "Yeah? She was quiet for a moment, watching Milo chase the foam at the water's edge. "The community, mostly. The way everyone knows everyone else's story. How Miss Doris brings you lunch, and Mary saves bacon for Milo, and Kenny at the hardware store treats every customer like family. And here I thought it was just our historic architecture that caught your eye." Charlotte laughed, the sound carrying on the wind. "Well, that too. Especially when it comes with such a knowledgeable tour guide." She bumped her shoulder against his. "Your passion for this place is contagious. The way you tell the stories, how much you care about preserving everything. Not just the buildings, but the memories they hold." Grant felt warmth spread through his chest, despite the cold air. "The island's lucky to have you capturing it. You see things others miss. Maybe I'm seeing it through your eyes." The words seemed to surprise her as much as him, and she quickly added, "Though Milo probably deserves most of the credit for helping me explore." "Smart dog." Grant watched as Milo trotted back to them, dropping a piece of driftwood at their feet. "He knew you belonged here before any of us did." Charlotte's steps faltered slightly. "I've been thinking about that, actually. Belonging somewhere." Grant's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice casual. "Oh? It's strange." She picked up the driftwood and tossed it for Milo. "I've spent so many years moving from place to place, always looking for the next story to tell. But lately..." She trailed off, watching Milo bound after the stick. "Lately?" Grant prompted softly. "I don't feel that pull anymore. To keep moving." She wrapped her arms around herself against a gust of wind. "For the first time in years, I feel still." Without thinking, Grant shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You'll freeze," she protested, but made no move to return it. "I'm fine." His hands lingered on her shoulders a moment longer than necessary. So, what's next for you? After the book is finished? Charlotte pulled his jacket closer around her. It was too big for her, making her look smaller, more vulnerable. I don't know. That's what's strange. I always know what's next. Always have a plan, another project lined up. She gave a small laugh. But now? I keep thinking about that message you mentioned. Found my home. Grant's heart thundered in his chest. He thought of the brass tokens waiting in his workshop, of all the things he wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. They had reached a cluster of weathered pilings, remnants of an old pier. Charlotte leaned against one, and Grant stood close enough that their shoulders touched, sharing warmth against the growing chill. Milo flopped down at their feet, apparently worn out from his beach adventures. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Out on the water, a shrimp boat headed home, its running lights just visible in the gathering dusk. Whatever you decide, Grant said carefully, the island would be lucky to keep you. Charlotte turned to look at him, and for a moment, Grant thought about closing the small distance between them, about finally showing her exactly what he felt. But before he could move, Milo jumped up, shaking sand everywhere and making them both laugh. I should head back, Charlotte said, reluctantly shrugging off his jacket. I've got some photos to edit before tomorrow. Right. Grant took his jacket, trying not to notice how it smelled like her now, like salt air and something floral. Thanks for the company. Thanks for the jacket. She smiled, then surprised him by rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. See you around, Grant. He watched her walk back up the beach, Milo trotting at her heels, until they disappeared around the bend toward the parking lot. The spot where her lips had touched his cheek tingled in the cold air. Chapter 7. Charlotte woke to Milo's cold nose pressed against her hand. His tail thumped against the hardwood floor of her rental cottage. It was a tiny place just off Main Street that she'd started thinking of as home somewhere between hanging her first load of laundry and stocking the kitchen with coffee mugs. 5 more minutes, she mumbled, but Milo was insistent. He grabbed the edge of her comforter and tugged, then darted to the front door. All right. She followed him, wrapping herself in a thick cardigan against the February chill. But make it quick. It's freezing out there. When she opened the door, Milo bounded straight for the porch steps and stopped. There, weighted down by a smooth piece of driftwood, was a cream-colored envelope with her name written in a steady hand. Charlotte's heart skipped as she picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. She slipped her finger under the flap and pulled out a single note card. Meet me here at 4 o'clock. I have something special to show you. Grant. That was it. No explanation, no hint of what he had planned. Charlotte read it 3 more times before Milo's whine reminded her why they'd come outside in the first place. Back inside, she set the note on her kitchen counter and started her morning routine, though her thoughts kept drifting to Grant. To the way he'd given her his jacket on the beach, how his hands had lingered on her shoulders. The soft look in his eyes when she'd kissed his cheek. What do you think he's planning? She asked Milo as she poured her coffee. The dog just wagged his tail and looked expectant. Right. You probably knew about this already, didn't you? The morning crawled by. Charlotte tried to work, reviewing photos for the book, but she kept getting distracted. Every image seemed to remind her of Grant. The careful restoration work at Indigo Bluff, the lighthouse where they'd almost kissed, the beach where she'd finally admitted she was thinking of staying. By 3 o'clock, she'd changed clothes twice, settling on a soft sweater in deep blue and her nicest jeans. She'd just finished braiding her hair when she heard the rumble of Grant's truck outside. Milo beat her to the door, tail wagging furiously. Through the window, she watched Grant climb out of his truck. He'd dressed up too, in dark jeans and a charcoal gray sweater that made his eyes look stormy. Her stomach did a little flip. Hey, she said, opening the door before he could knock. Hey yourself. His eyes traveled over her, lingering for a moment. Ready for an adventure? Depends. Are you going to tell me where we're going? Nope. He smiled, reaching down to scratch Milo's ears. That's part of the surprise. The drive was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence and the occasional comment about places they passed. Grant turned onto a narrow road she'd never noticed before, one that wound through a stretch of pine forest. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches, creating patterns on the truck's hood. Charlotte sneaked glances at Grant as he drove. His profile was strong against the light, and his hands were steady on the wheel. She noticed he'd rolled up his sleeves, exposing his forearms. The detail shouldn't be as distracting as it was. Milo sat between them on the bench seat, his head swiveling back and forth as if he couldn't decide who needed his attention more. When Grant turned onto an even smaller track, barely more than a trail, Milo's tail started wagging with obvious recognition. Almost there, Grant said softly. The trees opened up suddenly, revealing a hidden cove Charlotte hadn't known existed. The water stretched out before them, deep blue in the late afternoon light. Old oaks draped in Spanish moss created a natural archway leading down to a small, sandy beach. Grant parked in a cleared area and came around to open her door. Watch your step, he said, offering his hand. Path's a little steep. His palm was warm against hers as he helped her down. She expected him to let go once she was steady, but his fingers remained linked with hers as they started down the path. I found this place my first year doing restoration work, he said, his voice quiet in the stillness of the cove. Was checking some property lines for a project and stumbled onto it. Been coming here ever since. It's beautiful. Charlotte took in the way the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and pink. The air was unusually still, protected by the natural bowl of the cove. Not many people know about it. Grant led her toward a fallen log that made a perfect bench overlooking the water. Thought you might like to photograph it sometime. But today? He hesitated, and Charlotte felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Today I wanted to share it with you for a different reason. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest as they sat down. Milo settled at their feet, unusually calm, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Grant, she started, but he shook his head. He took a deep breath. There's something I want to give you. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting everything in golden light, and Charlotte held her breath. Grant reached into his jacket and pulled out a wooden box about the size of a book. The wood was deep mahogany, polished to a soft shine, with brass hinges that caught the fading sunlight. Charlotte's breath caught at the obvious care that had gone into making it. He cleared his throat. After our conversation about sweetheart candies, I couldn't stop thinking about messages that matter. Real ones. He placed the box in her hands. It was warm from being carried close to his body, and she could feel the slight roughness of hand-carved details under her fingers. Open it, he said softly. Charlotte lifted the lid, and tears pricked her eyes. Inside, nestled in dark blue velvet, were brass tokens, cut in the shape of hearts. Each one was perfectly sized to fit in her palm, with messages carefully engraved in Grant's precise hand. She picked up the first one. Be brave, she read aloud, running her thumb over the letters. Because you are, Grant said. Moving from place to place, always starting over. That takes courage. The next token read, Stay a while. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest as she traced the words. That one's a bit selfish, Grant admitted. His voice was low, intimate in the quiet of the cove. I'm not ready for you to leave. When she lifted the last token, the largest one centered in the box, a tear slipped down her cheek. Found my home. Charlotte. Grant's hand covered hers, both of them holding the token. I've spent my whole life preserving other people's stories. But since you arrived, I've been thinking about my own. About what's missing. She looked up at him, caught by the intensity in his blue eyes. You see this place the way I do, he continued. But you see more too. You show me things I've walked past 100 times, but never really noticed. You make me look at my own home through new eyes. He took a shaky breath. And somewhere between showing you the lighthouse and sharing coffee under live oaks, I realized something. Home isn't just about place anymore. It's about who you share it with. Grant. Charlotte's voice wavered. She set the box carefully aside and turned toward him. I've spent so long running. Taking pictures of other people's lives, other people's homes. Never staying long enough to build my own. She smiled through her tears. But here, with you? I don't want to run anymore. Then don't. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. Stay. Let me show you every hidden corner of this island. His voice dropped to a whisper. Let me love you. Charlotte leaned forward, closing the space between them. She caught the scent of sawdust and coffee on his sweater, familiar after so many shared moments. When their lips met, it felt like coming home. Like every photograph she'd ever taken trying to capture belonging had led her to this moment. Grant's hand cradled her face, and she felt his heart racing under her palm where it rested against his chest. His lips were soft against hers, tasting faintly of coffee and something sweet, like the orange cranberry bread from the coffee shop. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, as if he was afraid she might pull away. Then she pressed closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more real. The calluses on his fingers caught slightly against her skin as he traced her jaw, years of restoration work evident in their roughness. But his touch was infinitely tender, and Charlotte found herself melting into him, memorizing every sensation. The warmth of his breath, the strength in his hands, the way he kissed her like she was something precious he'd been waiting his whole life to find. Suddenly, a cold nose pressed between them, followed by an enthusiastic tongue. Milo had decided they'd had quite enough serious conversation. Charlotte laughed against Grant's mouth, before pulling back. Your timing is terrible, she told the dog, but she was smiling too hard to sound stern. I don't know. Grant kept one arm around her, using his free hand to scratch Milo's ears. He's the one who brought us together in the first place. They sat together on the bench, Charlotte tucked against Grant's side, while the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The brass tokens gleamed in their box, catching the last light of day. Happy Valentine's Day, Grant murmured into her hair. Charlotte picked up the Found My Home token, holding it tight. It certainly is. Milo settled at their feet with a contented sigh, and Charlotte smiled. Sometimes, it seemed, you had to travel the world to find what was waiting just around the corner. Sometimes home wasn't a place at all, but a feeling. A moment. A heart-shaped token in a handmade box, and the man who carved it just for you. The sun dipped below the horizon, but Charlotte had never felt warmer. She was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 8. Grant sat on his front porch, watching dawn creep over Palmar Island. Steam rose from his coffee mug, disappearing into the February morning. The small craftsman he'd restored himself sat on a quiet street just off Main, close enough to hear the small amount of traffic on clear mornings like this one. Far enough away that the sound of the ocean had a chance to filter through. He couldn't stop thinking about last night. About the way Charlotte's eyes had lit up when she opened the box, how she'd traced each token with careful fingers. The way she'd tasted like coffee and salt air when he kissed her, and how perfectly she'd fit against him as they watched the sunset. The porch swing creaked as he shifted, the same swing where he'd spent countless evenings planning restoration projects. Now all his plans seemed to revolve around Charlotte. Places he wanted to show her, stories he wanted to share, moments he hoped they'd build together. If she stayed. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Miss Doris's Oldsmobile rolled to a stop in front of his house, and the woman herself emerged carrying her usual basket. Beautiful morning, she called out, making her way up the path he'd laid himself, brick by brick. Perfect for sharing some company, and these blueberry muffins I pulled out of the oven. Grant smiled, standing to help her up the porch steps. You just happened to bake them? Well. Miss Doris settled into the porch chair he kept just for her, smoothing her skirt. I might have had a feeling you'd need breakfast this morning. Seeing as how you were otherwise occupied yesterday afternoon. Heat crept up Grant's neck. News travels fast. Small island. She pulled a cloth off the basket, revealing muffins that still steamed slightly. Though I didn't need the gossip to know you were planning something special. You've been distracted for days, working on that secret project in your workshop. Grant took a muffin, remembering how carefully he'd polished each brass token, how many times he'd revised the messages before engraving them. It wasn't anything fancy. A small gift. Miss Doris's steel-gray eyes studied him over the rim of the coffee mug he'd brought her. And did this small gift have anything to do with why your truck was parked at Miller's Cove until well after sunset? You checking up on me? Someone has to. She patted his hand. Now, tell me honestly. How did our Charlotte like her Valentine's present? Our Charlotte. The words made his heart twist pleasantly. She liked it. We talked about her staying. Maybe. Maybe? Miss Doris's eyebrow arched. Grant Lawson, that girl looks at you like you hung the moon. And I've seen how you watch her when you think no one's looking. It's not that simple. Grant stood, walking to the porch railing. Below, the garden he'd never quite gotten around to maintaining was showing the first hints of spring. She has a whole life, a career. I can't ask her to give that up. Did she say that's what it would mean? No, but. Then maybe you should let her decide what she's willing to give up. Or change. Miss Doris rose, gathering her basket. You know, when my husband first asked me to marry him, my mama thought I was crazy to consider it. Said I'd be giving up my whole future. Grant turned to look at her. In 40 years of knowing Miss Doris, he'd never heard this story. But you did it anyway? Best decision I ever made. She smiled, the morning sun catching her silver curls. Sometimes the future you're afraid of losing isn't half as precious as the one you're afraid to choose. She patted his cheek as she passed. Think about it, dear. And tell Charlotte those winter roses she photographed at Indigo Bluff? They're nothing compared to what my garden will look like come spring. In case she's wondering about the changing seasons here. Grant watched Miss Doris's car disappear around the corner, her words echoing in his mind. The harbor bells rang in the distance, marking the hour. Another workday was starting. He had doors to restore, buildings to save. But for the first time in his life, preserving the past didn't feel like enough. He wanted to build something new. Something with Charlotte. He looked down at his coffee, now gone cold, and made himself face a cold, hard truth. He was in love with her. Completely, terrifyingly in love. And whether she stayed or went, that fact wouldn't change. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the old wooden boards beneath his feet. Somewhere on the island, Charlotte was probably already up, camera in hand, finding beauty in things he'd seen 1,000 times before. Making his home feel new again, just by being in it. Grant stood, ready to start his day. Whatever Charlotte decided, he'd support her. But Miss Doris was right. He had to let her make that choice herself. Even if waiting for her answer felt like holding his breath underwater, hoping the surface wasn't too far away. Grant was working on the Thompson house doors when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel for the second time today. His hand stilled on the sandpaper as Milo's familiar bark echoed through the workshop. Charlotte's car door slammed, and Grant's heart kicked against his ribs. Through the open workshop door, he watched her approach. She wore jeans and that blue sweater he loved, her camera bag slung over one shoulder. But it was the look in her eyes that made him set down his tools. It was a mixture of determination and something else he couldn't quite read. Hey, she said, hovering in the doorway. Afternoon sun streamed around her, catching gold highlights in her dark hair. Hey. He wiped his hands on a rag, buying time. Didn't expect to see you today. I've been thinking. She stepped into the workshop, Milo trotting behind her. The dog immediately went to his usual spot near Grant's workbench, clearly at home among the sawdust and wood shavings. Sounds serious. Grant tried for a light tone, but his voice came out rough. Charlotte set her camera bag on his work table, careful to avoid the scattered tools and brass fittings. I had a meeting this morning with Evelyn Sutton. Grant's stomach clenched. This was it. She was going to tell him about her next assignment, her next destination. He leaned back against his workbench, trying to prepare himself. She introduced me to someone from the Historical Society, Charlotte continued. She was fidgeting with her camera strap, a habit he'd noticed when she was nervous. They're looking for someone to document the island's restoration projects. Create a permanent record of the work being done here. Grant's breath caught. Charlotte. Let me finish? She stepped closer, close enough that he caught the scent of her shampoo mixing with the workshop's familiar smells of wood and varnish. I've spent so many years chasing the next project, the next story. Always searching for something I couldn't quite name. Her voice softened. But then I came here, and you showed me all these beautiful old places. You taught me how to see the stories in every brick, every carved detail. She reached for his hand, her fingers sliding between his. And somewhere between that first morning at the Caraway Building and last night at the Cove, I realized something. I wasn't just photographing a place anymore. I was finding my way home. Grant's heart thundered in his chest. Are you saying? I'm staying. She smiled, and his whole world brightened. The Historical Society job is perfect. I can still travel sometimes for other projects, but Palmar will be my base. My home. She squeezed his hand. If that's okay with you. Instead of answering, Grant pulled her closer. His hands found her waist as hers slid up his chest. When he kissed her, he tried to pour everything he was feeling into it. His joy, his relief, his love. Charlotte made a soft sound against his mouth and pressed closer. A wet nose nudged their joined hands, followed by an impatient whine. I think someone approves, Charlotte laughed against Grant's lips. Smart dog. Grant kept one arm around her waist as he reached down to scratch Milo's ears. Knew you belonged here before any of us did. They sat on the workshop's small porch, Charlotte tucked against Grant's side while Milo dozed at their feet. The afternoon light painted everything golden, and the air was warm despite the February chill. I can't promise I'll never want to travel, Charlotte said softly. There are still stories out there I want to capture. Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. I wouldn't want you to give that up. But now you'll have somewhere to come back to. Someone to come home to. She turned to look at him, her eyes bright. I like the sound of that. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the workshop floor, Grant thought about all the moments that had led them here. The careful restoration of old buildings, parallel to the careful building of something new between them. How sometimes the most beautiful things were created slowly, with patience and dedication and love. What are you thinking about? Charlotte asked, noticing his smile. Grant pulled her closer. About how some projects turn out even better than you planned. She laughed and kissed him, and Grant knew that whatever they built together would be his finest restoration yet, not of an old building, but of two hearts finding their way home. Milo's tail thumped against the porch boards in agreement. Chapter 9. Charlotte woke to February sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and Milo's gentle snoring at the foot of her bed. Her tiny rental bungalow, just off the beach, had slowly transformed from a temporary space into something that felt like home. Her photography prints now hung on the walls, and the antique desk she'd found at the island's thrift store sat beneath the window, covered in notes and contact sheets for the coffee table book. Even the morning light felt different, less like something to capture and more like something to live in. She stretched and climbed out of bed, pulling on thick socks against the cold hardwood floors. Milo raised his head, decided it wasn't quite time to wake up, and promptly went back to sleep. In the kitchen, Charlotte started the coffee maker, inhaling deeply as the rich aroma filled the small space. She poured her first cup when she heard the familiar sound of Grant's truck in the driveway, followed by his boots on the porch steps. He didn't knock anymore. Hadn't for days now. The door opened, and there he was, holding a small bunch of bright yellow daffodils from the flower shop. Chloe says these mean new beginnings, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple as he handed them to her. Thought that was fitting. They're perfect. Charlotte buried her nose in the flowers, breathing in their fresh scent. She'd never been the type to keep fresh flowers around, but now she had a growing collection of mason jars that served as vases. Grant moved easily through her kitchen, grabbing his usual mug from the cabinet and pouring his own coffee. He'd brought pastries too, cranberry scones from the bakery, still warm. I thought we could tackle the Marshall boathouse today, she said, settling at her small kitchen table. It's the last location I need for the book. Ah, saving the best for last? Grant's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. That old place has some stories to tell. Care to share them while you help me with my equipment? Trying to get free manual labor out of me, Bennett? Always. She grinned over her coffee cup. Besides, you love it. An hour later, they pulled up to the boathouse. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, weathered gray wood stark against the winter sky. The structure seemed to lean slightly toward the water, as if listening for long-gone boats. Watch your step, Grant said, taking her heaviest camera bag. The ground's uneven here. Last spring's storms did a number on the shoreline. Charlotte followed him down the path, careful to avoid the deeper ruts. The boathouse had clearly seen better days, but that's what made it perfect for the book. It was a testament to the island's working history, waiting for its own restoration. While Charlotte set up her tripod, Grant examined the building's foundation. She loved watching him work, the way his hands moved over old wood with such care and knowledge. He pulled a few tools from his truck and began securing a loose board, the quiet sounds of his work creating a peaceful backdrop to her photography. The Marshall family used to run fishing charters from here, he said as she adjusted her lens. Old photos show dozens of boats lined up at that dock. Course, that was before the hurricane of '47 changed the shoreline. Charlotte captured the way the morning light hit the weathered walls, highlighting decades of stories in the grain of the wood. Think it could be restored? Maybe. Grant's voice held that tone she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was already planning, seeing possibilities in the worn boards and rusty hinges. The bones are solid. It just needs. A crash behind them made them both jump. Milo had spotted a ghost crab and, in his excitement to chase it, had knocked over Charlotte's equipment bag. Her extra lenses rolled across the wooden dock as Milo bounded after his prey. Milo, they called in unison, then broke into laughter as the dog ignored them completely, still focused on his elusive target. I got it, Grant said, already gathering her equipment. You keep shooting. Light's perfect right now. Charlotte smiled, watching him carefully check each lens before returning it to her bag. 6 weeks ago, she would have panicked at the thought of someone handling her expensive equipment. Now it felt natural, right? Like so many things about being here did. She turned back to her camera, but not before catching Grant's quiet grin as he watched her work. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and something tugged in her chest. This was what she'd been looking for all those years of traveling. Palmar Island wasn't just a place to belong, but someone to belong with. You're staring, Grant said without looking up from the board he was fixing. Just admiring the view. She snapped a quick shot of him working, loving the way his cheeks flushed slightly. Pretty sure the book's supposed to be about the buildings, not the carpenter. My camera, my rules. Charlotte lowered her lens just as Milo returned, looking extremely pleased with himself, despite his unsuccessful crab hunt. Besides, you're part of the island story too. Grant stood and crossed to her, brushing sawdust from his hands. And what story is that? The one about a wandering photographer who found her way home. She rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting coffee and salt air. Thanks to a very persistent dog and a carpenter who sees the beauty in old things. Not so old, he murmured against her lips. The dog or the carpenter? His laugh echoed across the water, and Charlotte caught that too with her camera, the joy of this moment, this place, this life she'd chosen. Some things, she was learning, were worth more than just photographing. They were worth living. The roasted bean glowed like a jewel box in the February evening, its windows steamy from the crowd inside. Charlotte paused at the entrance, taking in the scene. String lights twinkled overhead, and the usual coffee shop scents of espresso and pastries mingled with the warmth of mulled cider they'd prepared specially for tonight. "Ready?" Grant squeezed her hand. Inside, it seemed like half the island had turned out. Kenny from the hardware store was chatting with Mary from the diner. Mitch, Roasted Beans owner, had cleared space for a display of Charlotte's photos. Even Jacob Oswald had traded his work clothes for a sweater and dress pants. "There's our girl." Miss Doris appeared, pulling Charlotte into a hug that smelled of lavender and fresh-baked cookies. "We're so proud of you, dear." "Thank you for coming," Charlotte started, but more voices called out greetings. She found herself wrapped in the kind of welcome she'd never experienced in all her years of traveling. Milo worked the crowd like a professional, knowing exactly which hands were likely to slip him treats. He'd already charmed a cookie from Mary and was setting his sights on Miss Doris's pocket. "Charlotte." An elegant woman in her 60s approached, and Charlotte recognized Evelyn Sutton from their previous meetings. "These prints are extraordinary. You've captured exactly what I hoped for, not just the buildings, but their souls." "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton. That means so much." "Please, it's Evelyn." She gestured to a photograph of the Caraway building. "The way you've shown the light through those windows. It's as if you can feel the history breathing through the image." "She has a gift for that," Grant said quietly, his hand warm against Charlotte's lower back. "Seeing the heart of things." Charlotte leaned into his touch, remembering that first morning at the Caraway building. How different things had been then. She'd been focused on deadlines and perfect shots, not realizing she was capturing the first moments of her own story. "You two," Miss Doris declared, appearing with fresh cups of cider, "are the island's dream team. One preserves the buildings, the other preserves the memories." She raised her cup. "To our very own restoration specialist and his photographer." The crowd cheered, and Charlotte felt her cheeks warm as Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. Around them, conversation and laughter flowed easily. These people had become more than subjects for her book. They were neighbors, friends, family. Later, when the crowd had thinned and Milo had exhausted his treat-gathering opportunities, Charlotte and Grant stepped outside. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the sky. "Walk you home?" Grant asked, though they both knew he'd end up staying, as he had most nights lately. They strolled down Main Street, their joined hands swinging gently between them. Milo trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting smells. "I was thinking," Grant said, "about that boathouse." "What about it?" "It's got potential. Good bones, like I said. With the right restoration." He glanced at her. "Could be a nice studio space. For a certain photographer who might need somewhere to work." Charlotte's heart swelled. "Are you offering to restore a building just for me?" "Well." His thumb traced patterns on her palm. "I might have ulterior motives. Been wanting to expand my workspace anyway. Could be a good joint project." "A studio and workshop?" Charlotte smiled. "Very practical, Mr. Lawson." "I thought so." They stopped at the corner where Main Street met Harbor Drive. "Though I have some less practical ideas too." "Oh?" "Been thinking about that lighthouse on the outer island. Needs some work, but..." He pulled her closer. "Might make a nice spot for a wedding someday." Charlotte's breath caught. They hadn't talked about marriage yet, but the idea settled in her chest like it had always belonged there. "Someday soon?" Grant's kiss was soft, full of promise. "Whenever you're ready." They continued their walk, trading ideas about the boathouse renovation and other projects they could tackle together. Charlotte thought about all the places she'd been, all the beautiful things she'd photographed. None of them compared to this, the simple joy of walking home on a winter night, making plans with the man she loved, while their dog ran circles around their feet. At her front door, Grant pulled her close again. "Proud of you," he murmured into her hair. "The book is going to be amazing." "It isn't done yet." And for the record, I couldn't have done it without my tour guide. She pressed closer, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and coffee that clung to his sweater. Or my home. Above them, stars wheeled in the winter sky, and somewhere in the harbor, bells chimed the hour. Charlotte smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring more moments worth capturing, not just with her camera, but with her heart. She had all the time in the world to do both. Chapter 10. Grant woke before dawn, the soft sound of waves carrying through his bedroom window. February had brought milder temperatures, but the morning air still held a chill as he made his way to the kitchen. The house felt quiet. It always did in the early hours before Charlotte and Milo's usual visit. He started the coffee maker, his eyes drawn to the framed photograph on his counter. It was a picture of the Caraway building caught in early morning light, Charlotte's first shot on the island. She'd given it to him after the celebration at the Roasted Bean, and something about seeing it each morning made his house feel more like home. While the coffee brewed, Grant pulled out the cranberry scones he'd picked up the evening before. Charlotte was coming over for breakfast, and though they'd shared countless meals since that first Valentine's Day, today felt special. A quiet celebration of everything that had changed in the past few weeks. Cup in hand, Grant headed to his workshop. The carved frame he'd been working on sat on his bench, nearly complete. He ran his fingers over the detailed edges. Oak leaves and small flowers echoed the ones in Miss Doris's garden. The photo it would hold showed Charlotte and him at the coffee shop, caught in a moment of shared laughter. Miss Doris had captured it perfectly. Charlotte's head was thrown back, his eyes fixed on her face, both of them radiating joy. The sound of a car door slamming shut made him smile. Right on time. Morning. Charlotte called from the driveway. She carried a basket that smelled suspiciously like Miss Doris's famous cinnamon rolls. Behind her, Milo bounded up the path, tail wagging furiously at the sight of Grant. Don't get too excited. I just helped with the mixing. Still better than my attempts at baking. Grant met them at the workshop door, greeting Milo with a quick pat before pulling Charlotte close for a kiss that tasted like coffee and winter air. She smiled against his mouth. Good morning to you too. Milo circled their legs impatiently until Charlotte crouched to unleash him. He immediately began exploring the workshop, nose twitching at the various wood scents, while they settled into their usual spots. Charlotte was perched on the edge of his workbench, he sat in his chair. Morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes and the brass fixtures Grant was restoring for the Thompson house. How's the boathouse project coming along? Charlotte asked, breaking a cinnamon roll in half and passing him the bigger portion. Good. Foundation's more solid than I thought. Jacob's drawing up plans for the studio space now. He watched her face light up at the mention of their shared project. Thought we could start the real work once the weather warms up. Perfect timing. The Historical Society wants me to document the whole restoration process. She licked icing from her fingers, and Grant's heart did that familiar flip in his chest. Sort of a before and after series. Looking forward to having you on site. He reached for her hand, twining their fingers together. Though you're a terrible distraction. Me? She affected an innocent look. I'm completely professional. Sure you are. He tugged her closer, until she slid off the workbench and into his lap. Very professional. Charlotte's laugh filled the workshop as he pressed kisses along her jaw. What happened to breakfast? It can wait. But Milo chose that moment to drop his new favorite toy, an old piece of rope, at their feet, making them both chuckle. Someone's feeling neglected, Charlotte said, reaching down to toss the rope across the workshop. Milo bounded after it, tail wagging. Grant watched them, warmth spreading through his chest. Just weeks ago, this workshop had been his private space, filled with tools and projects, but empty of the kind of life Charlotte and Milo brought to it. Now it felt different. Everything was fuller, warmer, and felt more like the home he'd always wanted it to be. I have something for you, he said, reaching behind him for the carved frame. Charlotte's breath caught as she traced the detailed carvings. Grant, this is beautiful. thought that photo deserved a proper home. He watched her face as she studied his work. Like its subject. She set the frame carefully aside before kissing him properly, her fingers threading through his hair. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "I love you." It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but the word still made his heart race. "Love you too." They finished their breakfast as the sun climbed higher, trading stories and plans for the day ahead. Charlotte had a meeting with the Historical Society, and Grant needed to finish the Thompson house fixtures. But they'd meet for lunch at Mary's, as they had almost every day since Valentine's. Some might call it routine, Grant thought, watching Charlotte gather her things for work. But to him, it felt like the opposite. It felt like every day brought something new to discover, some new way to fall in love with her. "Don't forget dinner at Miss Doris's tonight," Charlotte called as she headed for her car, Milo trotting at her heels. "She's teaching me her secret cornbread recipe." Grant smiled, already looking forward to it. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across Palmar Island's beach as Grant and Charlotte walked along the shoreline. Milo trotted ahead, occasionally darting back to check on them before racing off again, to investigate interesting smells. "We could take that trip to Charleston in April," Charlotte was saying, her hand warm in his. "The Historical Society wants photos of some restoration projects there, and you mentioned wanting to see their preservation techniques." Mixing business with pleasure? Grant pulled her closer as a cool breeze swept in from the water. "Always." She bumped his shoulder with hers. "Besides, you're the one who kept pointing out architectural details during our last date night." Speaking of details. Grant stopped walking, turning her gently toward the water. "Look at how the light's hitting those waves. Reminds me of that shot you took at Miller's Cove." Charlotte's laugh was soft and warm. "Now who's the artist?" "Must be your influence." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head as they watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. "You've changed how I see everything." Later, back at his house, they settled on the couch with mugs of hot chocolate. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Milo had claimed his favorite spot on the rug nearby. "I have something for you," Charlotte said, reaching for her bag. She pulled out a leather-bound book, clearly handmade. "Let's call it a late Valentine's gift." Grant opened it carefully. The first page held a photograph of the Caraway building, the place where they'd met. Below it, Charlotte had written, "Where our story began." "You kept track of everything," he said softly, turning pages. There were photos of their lighthouse adventure, pressed flowers from Indigo Bluff, even a napkin from Novel Sips with a coffee stain in the shape of a heart. "Miss Doris helped," Charlotte admitted. "She had some snapshots I didn't even know existed." Grant paused at a candid shot of himself working in his workshop, completely focused on a piece of wood he was carving. "When did you take this?" "The day you started my Valentine's gift." "Not that I knew that's what you were doing." She touched the image gently. "You were so absorbed in your work, you didn't even notice me." "I always notice you." He set the book aside carefully. "Which reminds me." He retrieved the carved frame from his workshop, suddenly nervous despite their comfortable intimacy. "It's not as elaborate as your gift, but it's perfect." Charlotte traced the carved flowers with her fingertips. "Just like the creator." "Hardly perfect." But he pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just lucky enough to find someone who sees the best in everything. Even grumpy carpenters who interrogate photographers." "You weren't that grumpy." She settled against his chest, her familiar weight grounding him. "Though you did look pretty serious until Milo got involved." As if hearing his name, Milo lifted his head and gave a soft woof, before going back to sleep. "Smart dog," Grant murmured. "Knew what I needed before I did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance. Charlotte's breathing grew steady and deep, and Grant realized she was close to falling asleep. "Hey," he said softly. Thank you for staying. For making this place even more of a home than it was before." She turned in his arms, pressing a sleepy kiss to his jaw. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running. Grant held her close, breathing in the moment. Outside, waves lapped at the shore and stars wheeled overhead. But everything that mattered was right here, the woman in his arms, the dog at their feet, and the quiet certainty that this was exactly where they all belonged. Some stories, he was learning, didn't need dramatic endings. Sometimes the most beautiful ending was really a beginning, as simple and profound as finding your way home to the heart that was waiting for yours all along. Epilogue. Palmar Island, 1 year later. Spring had come early to Palmar Island, painting the landscape in soft greens and filling the air with the scent of sea grass and blooming jasmine. Charlotte smiled as Grant's truck wound along the familiar path to Miller's Cove, Milo's head hanging out the window. A year. It seemed impossible that only a year had passed since she'd first driven onto the island, camera in hand and deadline looming. Now every bend in the road held a memory. There was the hardware store where Milo had led her to Grant, the marina where they'd shared early morning coffee, Indigo Bluff where she'd begun to realize she was falling in love. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grant asked, his hand warm on her knee. "Just thinking about how much has changed." She covered his hand with hers. "The boathouse renovation is almost done. Thanks to your excellent supervision." "You mean my excellent photography." She grinned. "The Historical Society loves the documentation series. The whole island loves your work." His thumb traced circles on her knee. "Miss Doris says your photos of her garden should be in magazines." They pulled into the clearing near the cove, and Milo was out of the truck before Charlotte could grab his leash. But he'd grown more reliable over the past year, waiting at the trailhead while Grant retrieved something from behind his seat. "A picnic?" Charlotte asked, spotting the familiar basket. "Thought we could recreate that evening." He shouldered the basket, taking her hand. Though hopefully without Milo finding quite so many crabs to chase. The dog gave an indignant woof, but fell into step beside them as they walked the trail to the cove. The late afternoon sun filtered through new spring leaves, creating patterns on the path that begged to be photographed. But for once, Charlotte's camera stayed in its bag. When they reached the cove, her breath caught. Someone, Miss Doris, probably, had scattered fresh flowers along the path to their usual spot. A blanket was already spread out, anchored by shells and pieces of sea glass they'd collected over the past year. "You planned this," she said softly. "Guilty." Grant set down the basket and pulled her close. "Remember the first time we came here?" "Of course." She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and coffee that clung to his shirt. "You gave me the tokens. Made me realize I'd found my home." "And have you?" His voice was quiet. "Found your home?" Charlotte turned in his arms. "You know I have. The studio space in the boathouse, my work with the Historical Society, Sunday dinners with Miss Doris." She touched his cheek. You're my home, Grant Lawson." He smiled, but she caught a flash of nervousness in his eyes. "Good. Because..." He reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a small wooden box, similar to the one from last Valentine's Day but more intricately carved. "I have something for you." Charlotte's heart thundered as she opened it. Inside, nestled on blue velvet and scattered with rose petals, lay a single brass token. The engraving caught the sunlight, "Forever home." "Charlotte." Grant's voice was rough with emotion as he took her hands in his. "This past year has been the best of my life. Watching you photograph old buildings like you're discovering buried treasure. Seeing you charm the whole island, even Kenny at the hardware store." He smiled. "Finding your coffee cups in my kitchen and your camera gear in my workshop. Everything about you fits. Like you were always meant to be here." He reached into the box, brushing aside the rose petals, and pulled out a ring. The design was simple but beautiful, a vintage-style setting that reminded her of the historic metalwork they both loved. "I don't want to just share a home with you," he continued. "I want to build a life with you. Restore old buildings, and take new photographs and make every day an adventure." He took a shaky breath. Charlotte Bennett, will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. Yes, she managed. Yes, of course yes. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, and then Grant was kissing her, tasting of joy and promise and forever. Milo, unable to contain his excitement, jumped up between them, covering them both in sandy paw prints and enthusiastic kisses. You planned this whole thing, Charlotte laughed, wiping happy tears from her cheeks. Had some help. Grant pulled her close again. Miss Doris picked the flowers. Mitch packed your favorite tea in the thermos. Even Milo kept the secret. The dog wagged his tail at his name, then flopped down beside them as they settled on the blanket. Charlotte couldn't stop looking at her ring, the way it caught the light like one of Grant's brass tokens. Forever home, she read again, touching the token in its box. I love it. Love you. Love you too. Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. Ready to start our next adventure? Charlotte looked out over the water, then back at the man beside her. At Milo, who had brought them together. At the ring that promised a future filled with more moments like this one. She thought of all the places she'd traveled, all the beautiful things she'd photographed. None of them compared to this, the simple joy of saying yes to forever with the person who had helped her find her way home. Ready, she said, and kissed him again as the spring sun painted their world in shades of gold. Some journeys, Charlotte realized, weren't about the destination at all. They were about finding the person who made every place feel like home. And she had finally, beautifully, found hers. The end. This has been Valentine on Palmar Island. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.